Well, good morning, everybody. While we figure out the technical, I'll just introduce myself. So my name is Tonya Nelson, and I am Director of Museums and Cultural Programs at University College of London. But I actually had the opportunity last year to work with government, thank you, to go into government and work for the Department for Digital Culture, Media, and Sport on developing a new cultural strategy for the cultural sector. And so today what I want to do is talk to you, I want to divide my presentation up into two parts. First, I want to talk about the policy report that we developed called Culture is Digital, and give you a bit of a framework or understanding of how the UK government is thinking about how to support digital innovation in the cultural sector. And then I want to kind of switch hats back to my role at UCL as a cultural sector leader who doesn't have a tech background at all, but and really struggles to figure out the best ways to promote digital innovation within my own museums. And I just want to give you a bit of a case study on that. So that's the way we're going to move today with my presentation. I will present some of my ideas about potential solutions, but I in no way have the solutions, probably more challenges than solutions, but we'll go with that. Okay.
I think you need to point towards the...
Oh, sorry. Did it go? Okay, great. Okay. Yes, so the first part of my presentation, like I said, I was going to talk about new policies. And so, as I said, I worked for the Department for Digital Culture, Media, and Sport last year in a really interesting way. They decided in thinking about how they were going to create a new digital strategy for the sector by actually bringing in practitioners in to work with them to co-develop and co-write the policies. And so myself, along with 5 other people who are active practitioners in the arts, went into DCMS for 8 months to help them research and write the report that is called Culture is Digital. And you can find this report online at the DCMS website. And there you'll see, this is the National Gallery actually where we launched the report. This is where Chris Michaels works, who's going to talk to you a little bit later. So what I thought I would do is just tell you, first of all, what the objectives of the project was and what the objectives of the policy are. Oh, okay, it's going, okay. So the first one is to increase participation and engagement. So the whole idea was to try to think about how digital technologies can be used to increase our engagement with our audiences and reach new audiences. Within the UK, and I'm sure it's the same here, that government-funded organizations have the responsibility to try to reach as many audiences as possible. And so we wanted to think about how digital could help us do that. The second objective was to introduce a new digitization strategy, and that was really focused on museum collections. So I think there's been many different initiatives around digitizing collections, which is creating images of our objects and then putting them online. And most of them have not been that successful in terms of use or pickup. And so we wanted to understand whether or not the UK government needed to draft its own strategy around digitization of all of its collections. Third, we needed to think about this idea of new content innovation. That is kind of moving from this model of using digital to just simply disseminate content, but think about what types of new experiences we can have with digital and actually how to support digital artists and new types of art forms that are being underpinned by new digital technologies. And finally, we wanted to think about what skills we needed for the cultural sector in order to drive innovation. We wanted to think about intellectual property rules and how those things were either impeding or helping to advance the dissemination of cultural content. And we also wanted to think about business models. That is really about, thinking about our back offices, what we do that our audiences don't see. How can we make digital useful for making our operations more efficient and more productive? So that was that was a tall order for 8 months worth of work, but that was our objective. So, what were our outcomes? What were we seeking to achieve with this? 1, the UK retains its reputation for excellence in culture. the UK thinks of culture as being a big part of its brand. You know, it's a land of Shakespeare, and so it wanted to stay at the cutting edge of culture. And so a big part of this was thinking, how can digital help us retain this reputation for culture? Also, we wanted to think about how the cultural sector could actually partner with the emerging tech sector within the UK. AR, VR, AI are things that the UK is really becoming strong in. But one of the things we found was that the tech sector was not having enough content to work with in order to understand how to develop the technology, and that the cultural sector obviously was having trouble finding partnerships or finding ways of funding tech sector work or technological development. So we wanted to figure out a way for them to work together. Third, we wanted to think about how culture forms part of the UK's industrial strategy. So last year, the UK published a new strategy, and they really thought about how creativity drives innovation. And so thinking a lot about how we're going to use digital in a way to help that whole digital industrial strategy using creativity and culture. And finally, it was about trying to see whether or not digital can help the cultural sector become more financially sustainable. Now, I have to say, I think there was a bit of myth going on in the minds of our cultural ministers around digital and how much that would end up a windfall of money coming to cultural organizations. There's this kind of thought that, oh yes, if everybody can start crowdfunding, all the money will come to us and there'll be no need for government funding anymore. So we had to kind of, as the practitioners working on the project, we had to kind of bring that expectation down. But that was one of the things we were supposed to be considering. So, in terms of findings, so we did a lot of research. I mean, we consulted over 150 cultural organizations. We did lots of interviewing. And so we came up with a set of findings that really were going to drive the policy recommendations. One of the things we found was that digital does not equal increased participation. So just because you make something digital doesn't mean that suddenly you're going to be reaching all of these new audiences. In fact, what we found is sometimes what you're doing is what we're calling super serving existing cultural audiences. And so one example of this is the National Theatre in the UK that decided that it was going to do something called National Theatre Live, which is to show theatre performances in cinemas across the UK so that more people would have access to those performances. Now, in the beginning, I think there was a bit of fear that people would not go to the theater anymore and they would just go to the cinema. But that turned out not to be true, and it's been a very, very successful project. But what they found is actually the people who would go to the theater maybe 4 times a year now go to the theater 8 times a year, 4 times in the theater and 4 times in cinema. So what wasn't happening is that just the fact of making it available through a new means didn't necessarily mean that you got new audiences. So mass digitization without a target audience and end use has been unsuccessful. So there's been, I think, lots of initiatives, again, to image our collections and put them online with the hope, oh, people will just, come to them and use them for some reason without really thinking about, who's going to use them and what are they going to use these objects for? How are they going to consume this content? As I said before, and what was said earlier, which is digital was mainly being used as a mode of dissemination, and there wasn't really enough people really thinking about new types of content and new types of experiences. And finally, there was this big skills gap in leadership. So when I started off doing the project, I really was thinking very much on the ground in terms of, what are the technical skills an organization was going to need in order to be able to be digitally innovative. And I thought there's no answer to that because that really has to come from the organization understanding what their strategy is around digital, how they're going to lead a digital transformation project, and that from that would fall out what type of technical skills they would need for their particular organization. And so really what we started to think was actually where we have to do our work is supporting leaders within cultural organizations in becoming more skilled in how to develop a digital strategy, but also particularly around the idea of data, that we found that cultural leaders were not using data sufficiently to drive their decision making and understand their audiences better. So, policy outcomes. I'll explain where this slide comes from at the end. So one of the policy, I won't go through everything, I'm just going to kind of give you a short summary. But we thought the best way for us to make change was actually to go through the organizations that actually kind of implement policy and fund organizations within the UK. We have an Arts Council England, and we have something called the Heritage Lottery Fund, which uses lottery money to support big capital projects within the museum sector. And so what we had said was that UK arts funders will require more audience data as evidence for funding digital projects. So the idea is not that you lead first with this amazing idea and they fund something basically just on an idea, but really we're going to ask people to use the audience data that they have and get better at collecting and using it, and using that as evidence base in order to get funding to produce digital projects. We would introduce something called a digital maturity index. And what that is, and actually that idea actually comes from the charity sector in the UK, where a kind of benchmarking tool, an open source benchmarking tool, was used to assess an organization's digital development, how mature they are in terms of their skills and understanding in several different areas. So it could be, marketing, it could just be basic IT, it could be fundraising. And so what we're going to do for the cultural sector is build one of these maturity indexes that will allow organizations to benchmark themselves against others within the sector, so they kind of understand where they are. And the point of this is not actually so that you are digitally mature in every single area, but actually that you understand what your own particular strategy is. You decide where you're going to invest the money, where you're going to develop, and you're mature in those areas, but you're very, very aware of where you're mature and where you're not mature. Network of digital experts will be assembled to provide on-site advice and guidance. So this was the whole idea, is that it's fairly difficult for most arts organizations to hire in the tech expertise that they need. And so what we wanted to do is provide support for organizations, and support that wasn't, that could be brought into the organization for short periods of time. So we'll have a group of experts in particular areas that say you want to do something around live streaming performance or something like that, and you don't have the expertise or technologies to do it. You'll bring those people in for a short period of time to be able to get you started in that area, and then get you on your way so that you can progress on your own. So we're in the process of developing that network right now. And finally, a lot of thought around particular spaces that can be used for prototyping and experimentation. So what we want to do is get people away from the idea of project-based work for digital. There's a bit of what I call project fatigue, which is, you say you've got this great idea, you get some funding for that idea, and then you develop it, you deliver it. It either is successful or not successful, and then you just kind of, it stops there, and then you do another project, and it just becomes an endless cycle. And what we want to do is provide the kind of support for people to do small-scale projects that don't take a lot of money, and start to prototype and iterate more, so that they're not doing one large project, but they're constantly in the process of developing and rethinking projects or ideas that they've come up with and want to develop. Oops, how do I go back? Let's see. Oh, I've done it. Okay. So that was kind of a sort of whistle-stop tour through the policy piece of what we were trying to do. There's a lot more in the report that we've published, but that kind of gives you an overview of where we were going with the project. And yesterday I actually presented some of this at a different event, and I had questions from people who are kind of within the digital art world, digital artists. And I just wanted to say that one of our ambitions for this project was really to think about the role of artists in thinking about how we use culture to interrogate the effect and the impact of technology on the world as a general matter. And that was one thing that was part of the ambition, but we just didn't get there enough to be able to do a lot of recommendations and support there. But certainly pockets of funding are being driven towards those smaller scale organizations that are driven by digital artists and people who are in that realm. And actually on that point, I will go back to the photo that I said I would tell you about, if I can. Let's see. This one. So this is a project, this is a virtual reality project by an organization called Abandoned Normal Devices, so AND, and you can go on their website and see all of the work that they've done. But what this was inviting people to go into the forest, so to have a virtual experience outside, outdoors. And they were given the perspective, when they put these headsets on, of what it would be like to be one of three different types of animals that lives in that forest. So you could be a frog, and it would give you the perspective of what the forest looks like from the perspective of that particular animal. So it was a very cool project, and those are the types of organizations these days that the Arts Council is going to try to support in terms of their really particular specific work on AR and VR and digital experiences. So I'll go back to now part 2. So I'm now going to shift gears and talk about myself within UCL and a project that I led. So what you see on this screen is a 3D image of an ancient Egyptian footcase that is in the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology in UCL. We made that 3D image as part of a large-scale, multi-year, 5-year project aimed at improving laser scanning technology. And I want to use this as a case study to talk a little bit about how I started to think differently about digital transformation by giving you just this example. So I actually came into the university when this project had already started. And actually what I found was, and it's a very exciting prospect to think, particularly if you're a small museum. So the Petrie has 80,000 objects, but has a staff of 10, is a tiny space. And so the idea, the prospect of digitizing your collection and thinking it could be made available around the world was quite exciting to me. So when I came in, I thought, oh, this is a great project for me to pick up, knowing nothing about 3D imaging technology or anything like that, but just being excited about it. But what I found was actually it was kind of sad when I got there, because we had 2 people who were kind of doing the imaging work off in the corner, not engaging with the rest of the staff at all. It was a project that was done in partnership with a commercial company called Arius 3D, who wanted to enhance laser scanning technology, and our engineering department. And so basically the museum's part in that partnership was simply to hand over objects for them to trial and test, and then just give back to us, and then we would make an assessment of how accurate the 3D rendition was. And I just thought, this is a bit of a lost opportunity, really, because for the company that we're working for, yes, they may get to the point where they have laser scanning technology that is highly accurate and can produce quite good digital replicas of objects, but then the question is, so what? You know, what are they going to do with it? They're going to have a piece of equipment that at that time was going to cost £500,000 for any museum to buy. What were people going to do with these images? And I just thought they hadn't really thought that through, and they hadn't thought about how the museum was not only a place that has objects, but it has people and audiences that you can test things on. So what we decided to do was to change the project a bit, to say, actually, this is about, yes, improving the laser scanning technology, but was also about prototyping, coming up with all sorts of particular applications and uses for 3D images and testing them on the Petrie Museum audiences, so that we were doing the kind of, you know, the more, you know, cutting edge R&D, but we were also doing the application bit at the same time. And that really helped a lot in terms of how, as a museum team, we thought about digital transformation and what we thought about our own role in it. One of the things that I wanted to do quite quickly was get the entire team thinking about how we could use these 3D images. And so actually we brought the whole team together to start thinking about the different applications we could have, whether or not it was for improving teaching, whether or not it was a way for doing remote research, or whether or not it was about engaging audiences in new and different ways. We also thought about, it was part of the project, we were able to get this commercial company that we're working for to give us an extra bit of money to hire a software developer who would help work with us to develop new applications. And one of the decisions I had to make was whether or not I was simply going to farm out that work to an external software development company, or whether or not I was going to try to do it in-house by bringing somebody inside. And while to a certain extent I thought it was less risky farm it out and just let the experts do their thing, I actually said, let's bring somebody inside, let's bring somebody into our staff and see how that works, because actually that might help upskill the rest of the team on the idea of how do you go about the process of developing a digital application. And in fact, I hired a software developer and I set him in the middle of the staff room so that everybody had to cross his path. And it really was a great experience, because it helped us learn to speak in a different way. So people who are from the tech side speak in a certain language, and people from museums speak a certain language. And that was really nice to basically learn each other's language. And a lot of the ideas that our software developer would come up with would kind of seem interesting if you weren't working in a museum, like it was sort of without context. And similarly, some of the ideas that our staff had were things that either were just too advanced, that was something that you couldn't do quite easily, or for some reason had issue. And so we were able to kind of have those discussions in our organization in a way that we both learned something from it. And I feel that was a really good decision to bring that expertise in-house. And as I said, we created a whole range of prototyped applications. So we just started developing things. We never developed them to the point where we thought they were a finished product. All we did is we continued to have ideas, develop them, test them with audiences, get feedback, and then keep moving. And that was a really good, over I think a year and a half, we developed something around 9 to 12 different types of online applications, and tested them with our audiences. And so that was a completely new way of working within our organization. But what we found was, and again, this kind of now goes back to the policy piece that I was talking about in the beginning, was that because we did all of that prototyping and testing, we had lots of evidence that then we could go to the Arts Council and ask them for a bit of money to build a fully 3D interactive website called 3D Petrie. And so because we had all that experience, they felt confident giving us the money to develop this website, they'd not funded anything like that in the past. And so that was really something that really helped us. And so we did end up, and so this picture actually is a snapshot from what you can do on the website. If you go to the 3D Petrie website, you can click on an object and you can turn it around and you can manipulate it. And as you manipulate it, you get more information about the object. So I would say that the final thing about this project that I wanted to talk about is to say that it was a mistake to do the website, actually. In the end, I think it was a mistake to do it, because the Petrie is a small museum with a small audience, and actually the number of visitors to that site is not very large. Actually, we should have been thinking about where to put these digital assets where people would find them. And that's a lesson I learned about it. It's about not kind of thinking, oh, I've got to recreate my museum online with these 3D objects, but thinking, okay, how am I going to use them, and actually where is the best place to put them to be used? And doing that actually makes you also have to admit that some things in your collection are more interesting than others, and people will be drawn to particular things and they won't be drawn to other things. And so maybe you're not going to have a complete set of your objects done, in 3D, but you'll do the ones that actually are useful for whatever the end use you will have. So I just wanted to end by kind of summing up, I think, the new thinking that I think has come from my working on the Digital Culture project, but also my work at UCL. One is your audience is your partner. And I've struggled with what to say, whether or not I should say your audience is your collaborator or your audience is your asset, because it's also those things as well. But from the beginning of that project, one of the things we thought of is, instead of thinking of the museum as being only the object, the museum is a space in which you interact with audiences, and that's a valuable asset. A valuable asset for technology companies who want to develop new products and new applications. Also, the whole idea of doing kind of rapid prototyping and iterative design using user feedback means you're much closer to your audiences. You're kind of your co-producer in a lot of ways. And so I learned so much about how people consume the collection from the work that we did with the prototyping that I would have never known anyway. And we do, we do visitor feedback and all that type of thing. But actually, I learned a lot from the iterative design process that we had. Integration is key. So as I said, I think you can't just have digital off in the corner someplace. It has to be a core part of your strategy, and everybody in the team should buy into the use of digital technology, and it should be core to your mission. And again, it's not about saying that you have to be great in digital across the board, but just figuring out that one particular area where digital can add value. Good ideas require time and testing. So it goes back to my point about having that mentality of iterating and designing. But the other thing is some of the better ideas we got about how to use our 3D images came from people who were just kind of what I would say piddling around at lunchtime, like people who were just kind of having the time and space to think about it. And actually it was really funny because I had a conservator who, he was just playing around with models of 3D, of Shopties that we have. So we have thousands of Shopties, and we don't know exactly where they come from. But if you measure them in a particular way and look at them in a particular way, you can understand where they were likely produced in Egypt. And he said, okay, well, if we have 3D images of all of our Shopties, what we can do is just digitally put them on top of each other and see where the outlines match. And if they match, then we know they probably came from the same production site. And that's a way we can possibly trace the provenance of our collection of Shopties. And so he came up with that, kind of just having time to think about it and play with the images that we had. And finally, take content to the people. So I think it's really about thinking, where do your audiences live and breathe online, and putting your content there, as opposed to creating. For some organizations, you can create your own site and people will be driven there, but for other organizations, that's not going to work. And so it's about taking your content where people are. And I just have this picture here. This is from Trafalgar Square in London. And that was a project, a poetry project actually, where audiences, visitors can come and actually type in a word that's on their mind, and into this lion thing would come, and then it would draw out poetry related to that word or feeling. And then it was a process of then poetry was being written sort of at real time, and then being produced and spit out. But I just thought it was a really funny, interesting thing to have people at Trafalgar Square sitting there using a digital device. So I think that's the end of my comments, and I welcome any questions about the work that I've just covered. Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much, Tonya,
Yeah.
for the very interesting talk. And we would like to open up for questions now from you. If there are any, we'll get a microphone to you as quickly as possible. There's one over there.
Hi, could you tell a bit more about the network of digital experts you're building, and what kind of people and what kind of skills they have?
Yeah. Basically, this is something that's being led by the Arts Council England, so it's not being led by the Culture Department. And so they've just started recruiting. And so their skills around using social media and marketing areas, some around this whole idea of like live streaming, the ability to stream and do capture performances for live streaming and that type of thing. There are some around fundraising, so what are the skills around digital fundraising? So it kind of follows a sense of like functional area, people who are experts in those areas who can come in and kind of help you, kind of like a guerrilla, tactic thing where you come in and help you set up your infrastructure in those particular ways. So it's just getting off the ground now. So in fact, they were just advertising for the posts a couple of weeks ago. So we haven't seen the process work live yet. But there is an organization funded by the Arts Council called The Space. So if you go online and put The Space in, they are an organization that both do digital commissions, but they also do a lot of skill building work, and they've actually been successful in doing the same model. So we're kind of following on that model. So I think they've got some case studies about that on their website.
More questions? Yeah. Yes, over there.
Thank you. My name is Linn Staffner-Pfisterer. I'm Curator Education at the National Museum.
Yeah.
I was interested in how you were working with user testing. What's your best advice to do that in where you really get the good answers?
Yeah. So we kind of I think it was kind of 3 different types of testing that we would do. One, we would do focus group testing. One, we would invite people in to just do experiences and give feedback to an evaluator that was following them around. And then we did some online evaluation. So we had kind of 3 forms of how we were doing our user testing. And we basically did it based on what the type of experience we were trying to have with that particular audience. That's how we decided what type of user testing we would do. The focus groups were amazing in terms of getting people's insight about how their general feelings about the digital technology and how it was impacting on their experience. I think the probably most useful bits that we did is where we followed people around who were either using the technology. We actually kind of interviewed them while they were using the technology, because you get a sense of exactly, from those things like user friendliness. Is it kind of intuitive what you're doing? Is it? So people watching other people use the device and seeing, or the application, and seeing how they're running into problems or not running into problems. And then the assessment afterwards, we did a thing where we had a group of audiences who did an experience in the museum completely analog, just using our brochures and reading the labels. And then we had a group of people who did it with using only digital technology, so the apps and whatever. And what was interesting is at the end, when we tested them on their knowledge of the museum, they had the exact same knowledge, right? So it wasn't that the digital was improving, what they were learning. It was kind of about even. But what we found was, when you look at the age groups of the people who were doing the testing, that obviously the younger people enjoyed the digital version more than the analog version, and actually the olders liked the analog version and said, I would prefer to engage with the museum before doing the digital, but the digital is important. And it was the other way around for the younger audiences. They wanted to engage with the digital first and then engage with the museum and the real objects later. Yeah.
How big are your groups when you test on audiences, in terms of quantity?
So I think it was between 5 and 12. Focus groups were between 5 and 12. Mm-hmm. And then we were booking people in to do the kind of tours around the museum using the digital technology. So we were just booking them in 30-minute slots, and 30 to 40 people we would have in a given day.
More questions? Yes, right over there.
Hi, I'm Peter. I'm working in a 3D digitalization company right now. But I wonder, have you done any collaboration with the educational system in the UK? Because I see that they are really far ahead with teaching coding skills to the kids from early on, with the microbit chip and stuff like that.
Yeah. So we do. So I mean, in a sense, not directly, but UCL, which is a university, has done a lot of work in terms of what we call widening participation, which is going into schools and using knowledge from the university to help teachers do more interactive or engaging teaching, and getting people to aspire to universities. But I personally haven't directly dealt with school audiences or schools with the 3D imaging that we did. We were working more with UCL higher education students, and thinking about applications that would help them in terms of their classwork in higher education. So one of the applications we developed was an online cataloging tool. So for museum professionals and archaeologists, they have to spend a lot of time at the beginning looking at objects and understanding them and measuring them and getting that practice of how to look at something in a particular way. So we use the 3D objects online and created a tool in which they had to do the assessment online. They could, rotate the object, measure it with a digital measuring tool, that type of thing. And what we did was then with that class afterwards, we did an assessment of whether or not the lecturer thought that the students had better skills in terms of observation and analysis, having it supplemented by a tool that they could do at home and didn't have to actually be in the museum to be able to practice that skill.
Since this is an event about digitization, I thought I could also throw in a question from our digital audience, because we're also live streaming this event on our Facebook page. And here we got one visitor asking, would we fail better if we implemented more artist-driven development instead of technology-driven development? You got a thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this came up yesterday, actually. I mean, I think the role of the artist is something that we have to think about with this. And I'll admit that the Digital Culture project, didn't consider that part quite enough. But I think there's a really important role in that whole idea of the artist being there to drive what the experience is. And come up with more creative and creative ways of thinking about new types of experiences and new ways of looking at and shaping the world. So I do think that's something very important. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
I am Fred from the Oslo Philharmonic. I have one more question. You mentioned the Digital Maturity Index.
Yes.
Could you just tell a bit about how that works and how it rates organizations and how it can help them?
Yep. So there's a couple of different ones floating around out there. The one, sorry, sorry, let me just have some water. The one that I know the most about is from Breast Cancer Care UK, and actually they have an open source tool that you can actually adapt it for yourself if you want. But essentially what they do is they have a spectrum of 7 different, what you call like digital functions or functional areas. And what they do is you assess yourself. So they give you a series of questions underneath each area. So say it's marketing. You know, they will give you a set of questions and you'll assess yourself based on those questions. And then what will happen is you will plot yourself on a chart that tells you if 10 is the best and most mature and 1 is the least mature. You'll see where you plot in that on that range after answering a set of questions, and you do that across several different areas to get where you are. Then what you do is, based on that, you say, okay, we know that our strategy is, we have to be the best at, crowdfunding or something like that, fundraising. So we know that we want to go from being a 5 to a 10 in that area. We don't care about the rest of it. The others is fine. So we're now going to put together a strategy in which we, improve our skills around that, for whatever reason, or if it's infrastructure or something like that. And then you assess yourself again in a year's time or whatever period of time against that same marker. I think what was interesting with that organization is what they did is they developed the tool themselves, and then other charities started using the tool so that you could see what other organizations were doing. So if you wanted to replicate yourself on somebody, another organization is really good at X thing, you could look at their digital maturity and kind of try to replicate it. So I thought that was really interesting. And so what we're going to try to do is create that model for the cultural sector.
Since this policy document was published, Culture is Digital, do you already feel the effects that it had on the British landscape in terms of policy making, in terms of how cultural institutions embrace digital? What has happened since then?
So the report was published in March 2018, so not that long ago, it hasn't been a year. Okay. So I do feel what it's done is, again, raise digital on the agenda of organizations a bit more, and people now are sort of feeling like government is supporting them and thinking about digital. So I think it's kind of put it up on the agenda again. In the UK, actually, there was about 5 to 7 years ago, there's an organization called Nesta, and they do a lot of stuff around tech that's in culture, not culture. But they had partnered with the government and had this thing called the Digital R&D Fund. And so they were giving money for cultural organizations to do R&D development. And at that time, it kind of, because there was a pot of funding available, kind of raised digital up the agenda. But then what we found is since that fund has ended, it's kind of gone down. The interest has gone down, and I think it's because there's not a pot of funding associated with it. So the hope, what I'm seeing is that I think digital is getting on people's agenda again, reinforced by the fact that our Arts Council is requiring certain of its core funded arts organizations to submit a digital strategy along with its overall objectives for receiving funding. So the funders are really driving it forward by saying you must have a digital strategy. If you're a certain size, you're getting a certain amount of money. And I think some of the policy recommendations out of the report will start to have impact over time as we start to get them, the implementation in place. But we're kind of in a point where we haven't yet gotten all the implementation in place.
What is the time scale you have set for yourself in that document? What kind of perspective do you take?
Unfortunately, because most of what we recommended has to be delivered by somebody else. So it has to be delivered by the Arts Council, it has to be delivered by the Heritage Lottery Fund, it has to be, there are other partners like the National Gallery and the National Archive who are going to be helping us implement that. It's on the timescales of those organizations, but obviously there is a kind of a pressure to kind of get that up and running. And some elements of it, like the network, the skilled network thing, they're in the process of creating that network now and hiring those people with the hope that they'll start, in the new year to be able to support people.
Okay. Thank you. Any more questions? From Facebook? Okay. Yeah. Can you just read it?
This is from Asbjørn Goa, and he asks, what strategy do you implement for long-term storage of digital material?
That's getting into the, and I don't have the answer for that. I don't have the solution for that. We are, yes, yeah. So that was one of the issues I had to tackle that I never did really get around, is actually, as we were building these huge data sets with 3D images, where we were going to put them, where we were going to store them, and we actually, had to get a new server, an independent server, and that kind of thing. And that was one of the, if that project had continued on, that would have been ultimately something we would have had to deal with and really sort out. But I don't have a good answer for you, unfortunately.
So it was the heavy, nasty questions coming from Facebook. All right, but I think, Stein, do you? Okay.
I just have a question about something that you mentioned, and of course, as in Norway, most of the cultural institutions in England is publicly funded to some extent. Could you say a little bit more about the funders? What preconditions do they have for the funding? What inspiration do they do, and what kind of money is following up? What is the picture, do you think, right now?
Well, I think one of the things that came out of our research findings for this report is our funding organizations are not equipped to analyze digital projects. They're not equipped to understand what they should be funding. And so part of this work will also be about those organizations upskilling themselves in terms of digital, so that they're not just attracted to the new shiny thing that somebody puts forward, but can really assess something based on user data and that type of thing. In terms of funding, so the Arts Council is about to go into drafting a new 10-year strategy, and as part of that, they'll be thinking about how to recalibrate their funding to support more digital, and not just digital projects, but digital infrastructure. I can't put numbers on it right now, but certainly I'll say this. It's not as if a huge influx of money has come to support this. It's really more about kind of recalibrating where the money is going to support it. I was going to say something else about that. Yeah, I mean, it's really about recalibrating the money that we have to think about what's placed on digital and what's not placed on digital. Our Heritage Lottery Fund, which has been an organization that actually funds bricks and mortar developments, is also starting to think about how actually they should be thinking about digital, because that's a new area in which that's kind of like a bricks and mortar type thing. So they're going to invest more in that kind of capital development that you need in order to have the infrastructure for digital.
All right, I think we can wrap it up here. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tonya.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Which means that we're going to have a slightly longer coffee break. We meet again here at 11:30.